And welcome back, comrades. Welcome to, I have to say, my favorite case study of the six. Our coverage this week of Russia involves a country that I'm fairly certain all of you know about, and you definitely know who has been in charge for the past 20 or so years. Russia is, well, there's nothing subtle about Russia. I don't think there ever has been anything subtle about Russia. For all of the complexities that are needed to understand a country like Venezuela, Russia is, if anything, just out in the open, right? It's big. It's perceived to be aggressive. Russians are at their most comfortable when they are an empire. They are at their most unstable when they attempt to cosplay as a republic. And so when we talk about Russian politics for this class, it is difficult, if not impossible, to disassociate Russia from the leadership of Vladimir Putin. So we're going to be talking a lot about Putin's role as Russia's president from 2000 up to the present. But you do know, right? You do know that Russia as an independent country has existed for an additional 10 years prior to that, right? You do know that Russia as a standalone country emerged at the end of 1991, 1992, when the Soviet Union broke up, into a series of 15 separate independent states. And if you can name all 15 of them, you definitely are a geography nerd. There's Russia, there's Ukraine and Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and then we get to the stands: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. I think I got them all. Yeah, I got them all. There we go. But it is Russia that we're going to be talking about for this week. And because the leadership of Putin is so important as not just the case study of Russia, but as a way of understanding this top-down, heavy executive hybrid type of leadership, I, in all likelihood, am going to give you two lectures this week, or at least two lectures that, are large enough to be broken up into two lectures. So what I want to do for this one is provide somewhat of the predictable historical background to what Russia has been over the past 30 years, where it came from the Soviet Union, and also not as a way of excusing Putin's leadership, but hoping to teach you how to understand Putin's leadership. In fact, this is probably the first thing that I want you to really jot down for this week. And that is, there is a reason why someone like Vladimir Putin does what he does and is as popular as he is among the public. And when I say popular, the man has an approval rating that rarely dips below 70%. Like on bad days, his popularity is still somewhere in the mid 60s. And that is approval ratings the likes of which democratically elected leaders would kill for. Just absolutely kill for. So, there is, I think, a genuine sense of support that Russians, especially Russians outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, give to him. So the man has to be doing something right. And, while I'm not excusing his type of authoritarian leadership, perhaps what we can do is put it into a better contextual understanding, for us to move forward. So some basic facts, just some real basic facts about Russia, right? It is and has been, I would say, for the last 15 years or so, a major country that is emerging, or some would even say re-emerging, as a political and economic force in the Eurasian region. Russia is the R in BRIC countries. And if you remember from shortly before spring break, we talked about these BRIC countries, B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These are kind of the new kids on the block, the new economic and regional powers within their respective regions. And Russia is one of those countries that straddles both Europe and Asia. Russia is certainly a major force in European affairs. It is the reason why NATO still exists today. And while it, shares that top spot in Asia with China, Russia is certainly a country that is worth courting and being on one's good side than antagonizing. So I don't want to say that Russia just overpowers everybody else, at least economically speaking. Russia's economy is kind of equivalent to that of Italy's. But Russia is a country that is a major producer of raw materials, especially natural resources. And, stemming from our discussion last week of Venezuela being a rentier state, Russia is somewhat more of a diversified economy, but a large part of its economic revenue relies not just on oil, but even bigger, natural gas. And Russia's biggest economic asset is effectively heating large parts of Central and Eastern Europe. So while they might not be the biggest economy in the region, they are certainly one of the most important and definitely one of the most unavoidable. Now, what makes Russia even more important to study is that Russia is not, and it really has never gotten anywhere close to being a consolidated democracy. I would even go so far as to say that at its best, Russia was a stalled transitioning democracy in the 1990s. Right? This is before Putin became really known to much of the rest of the world. But under Putin, especially in the last 10 years or so, right, we have seen a significant reversal of democratic transition to the point where Russia went from being a partly free state, according to Freedom House metrics, to now being a not free state, right? Now, it is not a full-blown dictatorship, but it's very hard. It is very hard to consider a political alternative in Russia today that challenges Putin and is not approved by the establishment. So in that sense, right, Russia is, for the most part, an autocratic state. And again, the reason behind this, and again, I'm not excusing it, but in order to understand the politics of Putin, you need to understand the decade that befell Russia beforehand, and that's the 1990s. And so Russia has gone from a stalled transition undergoing economic shock therapy of Boris Yeltsin to the type of paternalistic, stabilotocratic, sovereign democracy of Vladimir Putin. And at the risk of giving the plot line for the rest of the lectures away, but one in which you can base your thinking on, in order to understand the politics of Vladimir Putin, you need to understand where Russia was in the 90s, and you need to understand the genuine fear and uncertainty that many Russians felt in the 90s, especially Russians who remember the stability of the Soviet Union, then were undergoing this period of rapid political, social, and economic change, only to look at Putin as, I don't want to say a security blanket, but definitely someone who is providing law, order, stability, and direction. And even among Putin's critics, right, except for some of his most outspoken critics, but even among his critics, they have to applaud him for basically running a country, for the most part, on his own. I mean, the man is, to a degree, a modern-day czar. And, if he was to decide that he was going to appoint himself czar, I'm pretty certain about 50 to 55% of the population would be totally okay with that, all right? Another thing to understand about Russia, and this is what I said before, as a regional power, Russia is neither completely Western, nor is it Asiatic. Right? When we talk about Western and Eastern, when we talk about Western Europe versus the Middle East or the Orient, right? I mean, we have these discernible adjectives that regionalize and compartmentalize the world into these, little cookie-cutter communities. Russia is kind of everywhere and nowhere. right? Russia definitely has Western-leaning traits. You go to Moscow or St. Petersburg, it is as cosmopolitan, as urban, and as developed as New York or London or Paris or Berlin. But at the same time, it is clear, right? It is absolutely clear that the whole concept of Western-based identity kind of bounces itself off of what is perceived to be the norm in Russia. But Russia is not Asiatic completely either, right? It is not entirely Eastern. It is not Oriental in that sense. And so Russia is kind of Russia, right? It's a little bit of both. And I think that when one understands it to be both Western and Eastern, Occidental and Oriental, we get a better picture of a country that is, 15 time zones? 8 time zones? It's either 8 time zones that takes you 15 days to cross from one to the other, or it's 15 time zones that take you 8 days to cross from one to the other. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about, like, you want to take a train from Western Russia to Eastern Russia, you're going to be prepared to be on that train, for, a week. All right. So, to move forward with this discussion here, because I'm still introducing you to a country that we all know, right? Russia is also a post-Soviet state, right? So it is a country that emerges from a collapsing larger country that, kind of provided the counterbalance to the United States for about 45 years during the Cold War. And, like all of these single-party bureaucratic authoritarian states in Eastern Europe that unravel around 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union follows suit at the end of 1991. And the fact that the country collapses amid an internal political coup and social revolution kind of wakes about 85 to 90% of the people up one morning that a country that they thought was stable and permanent no longer exists. So the Soviet Union does not collapse because it lost a war or there was some major economic collapse or downturn. The Soviet Union just kind of ran out of gas and just kind of realized, its internal leaders realized that it's just not feasible to run this country anymore. And again, with the exception of maybe 2 students in both my undergraduate and graduate class, none of you have any working knowledge of the Soviet Union, and none of you have any knowledge of living in the United States in the 70s or the 80s, when Cold War propaganda was, running at its height. It's similar today in the which that, any political leader that doesn't like what's being told about them, is blamed on some Russian spy or whatever the hell it is. I mean, this is a leftover from the Cold War period. And, I remember I was in middle school when the Soviet Union collapsed, and this was like a major victory for us, right? I mean, we beat the bad guys. We beat the evil empire. And, the United States goes on throughout much of the 1990s in taking, self-appointed victory laps while the Russians are just kind of forced to, lick their wounds, swallow their pride, and realize that, they lost the battle of ideology. But, in order to really get a sense of Russian misery, the Soviet Union collapses into political, economic, institutional, and cultural turmoil. So it's not like Russia just sort of emerges as this new democracy that's ready to join the ranks of other countries. I mean, no. The fall of the communist power monopoly effectively takes away much of the country's working political apparatus. Not only that, stuff that people just learned and just took for granted ideologically for decades on end now suddenly makes no sense. Right? Statues of Lenin and Marx and Stalin are being removed. And Russia is basically being told to just join the ranks of countries through capitalism rather than democracy in this sense. And, within all of this turmoil, there is this internal struggle to figure out what exactly is Russian as opposed to Soviet. Because much of the Soviet accomplishments And yes, I have to acknowledge there were accomplishments, were Russian accomplishments as well, right? It's just kind of one of these things where even in the United States, we used to euphemistically call the Soviet Union Russia in that sense. So, the Russians put a man in space. The Russians won the, Olympics. The Russians are blockading Cuba. The Russians have better mathematicians and physicists, right? And even though these quote-unquote Russians were, Ukrainians and Belarusians and Georgians and Kazakhs and, whoever, it didn't really matter. So when the Soviet Union collapses, much of what Russia just kind of took as its own identity is no longer valid. So there's this need within Russia to find other things, right? And what exactly are they? Well, as much as I hate to play the legacy card, right? Russia does not have a real stellar record of democratic governance, right? Constitutional monarchy or anything else like that, right? I mean, prior to the Soviet Union, there was the, weak, teetering Russian Empire that, in hindsight, you almost have to say to the Soviet Union, thank you for, putting it out of its misery. So, in a way, as much as Russia or Russian is such a pronounced culture, language, identity that has produced, art, literature, poetry, science, philosophy, and whatever. We're talking about a country emerging from the Soviet Union really with little to no identity beyond, geography, religious identity within the Russian Orthodox Church, and some rudimentary forms of political culture that, yes, create the foundations for what will become a post-Soviet Russian identity, but one that is kind of schizophrenic in the 90s because there is this push to sort of de-Marxify, de-communist Russia as much as possible, and easier said, than done. So that may help explain why the transition to democracy in Russia was as problematic as it was. And that's not to say that Russians are incapable of engaging in democracy. I mean, for the most part, you ask Russians on the street, do they believe in the tenets and philosophies of democracy and representative government? And they'll say, absolutely, right? Absolutely. The only problem is that the leadership of the country, the political society, the state apparatus, the bureaucracy, remains largely authoritarian-minded. And so you might think to yourself, well, do they feel the same way about Vladimir Putin? And interestingly enough, and we're going to get to this, maybe in the second lecture, but Putin is able to kind of market himself as someone above this corrupt, elitist, bureaucratic, unstable fray here. And what he's also going to do, and he's going to do this really, really well, is that he's going to market himself as the counter Yeltsin. Even though Yeltsin is the man that puts him in power in 2000, Putin is going to market himself as the exact antithesis of the instability, the ineptitude, the bureaucratic uncertainty, and just the relative chaos of the 1990s. And he does this quite well. So therefore, in order to understand Russia under Putin, we have to look at the Yeltsin era, right? Russia between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Vladimir Putin. And under this period, Russia was led by President Boris Yeltsin, okay? A man who was, at least initially, right, an outspoken critic of the Soviet Union and the mismanagement of communism. Within a few short days, and when I say short, I mean 3 to 4 days, that leads from a coup trying to restore power in the Soviet Union to the whole thing just collapsing and just being buried. Boris Yeltsin emerges as some popular hero in Russia that is going to, flip the switch on the Soviet Union. Resign the whole thing to history and reestablish the Russian Federation, right? The hammer and sickle come down, the Russian tricolor flag, reemerges, and, there is this initial feel-good period that, oh, look at this, communism is dead, democracy has won, end of history, blah, blah, blah. In hindsight, right? It didn't really take long, folks. I mean, we're talking by 95, 96, it was pretty apparent, right, that Russia was this mishmash of a country that on one level engaged in democratic pluralism amid rampant corruption. like grotesque corruption, political fragmentation, and economic breakdown. And this is not unique to Russia. I mean, this is kind of indicative of any country that is experiencing systemic collapse of a previous regime, a previous government that held a monopoly on power for years, if not decades. Okay, you can look at any country that finally overthrows, a hegemonic order, and unless there is some real negotiated transition to power that is planned over the next, 8 to 12 months. You're going to be engaging in kind of a, do-it-yourself, go on your own type of approach to this. And this, unfortunately, was the nature of Russia, which in hindsight was probably one of the worst things to befall a country as large as it was, as armed as it was, and as nuclear as it was. Now, on top of all of that, Russia emerging, the Soviet Union collapsing in the 1990s, and, really pay attention here, because in order to understand the rest of Russia, you gotta understand this, so lend an ear. Russia emerging in the early 1990s is occurring right around the time that the age of globalization begins. And while globalization itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Globalization is just simply the spreading and sharing of information, right? That's it. That's all that it really is. It's just the connecting of previously separate groups. But what is doing the connecting and what is driving the globalization is really what is important here. And what's important is that the 1990s really saw a definitive victory for free market capitalism, not for democracy. So if you want to ask who won the ideological battle in the Cold War, it wasn't Alexander Hamilton versus Karl Marx. It was Adam Smith versus Karl Marx. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say, now, I used to say this. I used to say Adam Smith beat out Karl Marx. But technically speaking now, and this was sort of a slip over the past few years, Adam Smith would not engage in the type of rampant free market fundamentalism that defined the age of globalization. I would go so far as to say Milton Friedman. Okay? Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, these are disciples of capitalism that believe that the more free the free market is, in other words, the less encumbered the free market is by state regulation, by state law, by state institutionalism, the more money can be made. Right, the more prosperous people can make. Right? So Adam Smith never really said this, but we're talking about modern-day 20th century free market fundamentalists. The type of people that kind of led us to where we are today. In this global pandemic virus, where we have no health care outside of a decent-paying job, and if you lose that job, well, you lose your health care. Right. So it's that kind of rampant capitalism that defines the age of globalization, and these capitalist witch doctors back then, Jeffrey Sachs and Alan Greenspan and, people who, not only read the Wall Street Journal, but write editorials for the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or people like that, right? What they do is they look at Russia. They look at all of Eastern Europe at the time, right? And they see that these countries are emerging from communism. Or at least they think that they're emerging from communism. Their understanding of communism is that there is no market that ever existed beforehand. And so their very rudimentary understanding of communism is that all of these countries were planned economies, just ridden with breadlines and food shortages. If you're online today and you see a lot of these right-wing memes that make fun of socialism, where there's no food in supermarkets, you got to wonder how these people survive for 75 years, right? But the point here is that a policy of shock therapy, economic shock therapy, was what was recommended for Russia, the former Soviet Union, and a good chunk of Eastern Europe. Now, what exactly is shock therapy? Shock therapy is, in so many words, become capitalist and go. Like, that's shock therapy. Shock therapy is just no transition period, no rudimentary baby steps in capitalism. Shock therapy is, I am going to teach you how to swim. But rather than take you to the Y or give you swimming lessons, or at the absolute least, put some, swimmies on you and start out in the shallow end, I'm going to take you and throw you headfirst into the deep end, okay? And your job is to swim or sink, right? So survivalism will hopefully kind of take over, right? This was kind of me when I was, 3, 4 years old or whatever it is. I just, went to a pool for the first time, and it wasn't the kiddie pool that my parents had in the backyard. I jumped in. I didn't know that you could go all the way down. And for a very brief moment, I thought, that's it, I'm going to die. And, survivalism takes over, and, you swim back up to the top. You can't really swim all that well, but you reach for the wall and you run out and you vow never to get into the pool again. Well, shock therapy is kind of like that, except the lifeguard constantly throws you back in the pool and says, you'll figure it out, stop drowning. And that's what Russia experienced. Right? Russia was just basically told by the IMF, the World Bank, all sorts of, transnational global corporations, lower your state, tariff protections, open your borders up to trade, let the market kind of guide you towards some form of progress and modernity. And, if you're a free market fundamentalist, yeah, it's going to work in the sense that your markets are going to prosper immensely in areas that it had not existed prior, right? Especially when your markets consist of well-known brands, like Mercedes, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, things like that, right? Things that the public wants, at least out of curiosity. But the problem here, folks, is that if you engage in this type of economic shock therapy, the only people whose lives are going to improve are the very, very small percentage of people with either the political or the economic leverage to somehow buy into this market. But if you're just a normal person and you don't have the money to engage in day trading or venture capitalism, well, suddenly you find that your life doesn't get better, but it starts getting comparatively worse. Because economic shock therapy also implies that in order to allow for external companies and industries and interests to grow in your country, you have to make it as lucrative as possible for them to be there. So that means tax breaks. It also means if you're going to hire, Russians or Ukrainians to do the job, well, you're going to be paying them, pennies on the dollar, because the market is not doing you any favors. We can move to Africa, we can go to China, we can go to Mexico, it doesn't really matter. So in order to get that investment, the state has to lower the wages of what was previously acceptable working class wages. And in addition to that, because everything is now privatized, the state no longer is responsible for things like unemployment, housing, transportation, healthcare. Things suddenly now come with a price, because that's kind of how free market fundamentalism operates. The more money you have, the more luxury you can purchase. And yes, this does make a number of Russians extremely wealthy, but it makes the vast majority of Russians completely unable to enjoy anything like this. And so when you see a small group of people literally becoming billionaires overnight, and you know that these people are not the most savvy, but they have political connections, they're attached to organized crime, they are, former Communist Party bosses who really should have been thrown in jail rather than become, McDonald's manager of the month, whatever it is, you're going to get resentful of the system. And that's why the Communist Party of Russia at the time, it didn't collapse, it just was simply kicked out of power. Right? We're not talking about the party just, dissolves and goes away. We're not talking about how its party leadership was all rounded up and sent to jail or they just died or whatever it was, right? I mean, for much of the 1990s, the Communist Party of Russia was trying in some way, shape, or form to get back into power. But interestingly enough, rather than arguing on restoring the Soviet Union and bringing back Marxism and the KGB and all that other nonsense, they were effectively saying, hey, look at how shitty your life has gotten. Was the Soviet Union that bad? Was it worth throwing the baby out with the bad bathwater, right? Was it worth everything being lost? Because now, all of a sudden, we have homelessness, we have drug addiction, alcoholism, worse than it ever was under the Soviet Union. We have crumbling apartments. In fact, all of the worst stereotypes that the West used to make about, the shitty living in communism, that wasn't the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. That was the 90s. Right? That was the 90s. And when this stuff now makes it onto TV, people in the West are looking at these conditions saying, oh, thank God they finally have capitalism to help them out. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. No. This capitalism was that brought them into this situation. Right? And, if things got as bad as it did as early as 1993, about 1 or 2 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Communist Party had effectively barricaded themselves in the Russian parliament, refusing to leave, effectively almost like, taking the building hostage as a bargaining chip with Boris Yeltsin. And what does Yeltsin do? He plays to international media to say the communists are preventing me from doing my job and orders the military, I kid you not, orders the military to attack the Parliament House. So if there ever was a time where the Communist Party was finally driven out of power by the military, it was through Russia's own army. Like, he literally calls for tanks to roll up the steps of Parliament, blow open the door and, pull these people out in a sense, right? Now, this gets him kudos in the West. This gets him accolades by Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schroeder, by John Major, by Margaret Thatcher, by whatever sanity is left of Ronald Reagan in that sense, right? But within Russia, it's seen more and more as just a deterioration of life and a furthering of unpredictable chaos. And while we're on the subject of talking about the military, okay, the Russian military in the 1990s was just completely and utterly inept in that sense, right? I think one of the secrets that the Soviet Union was keeping, not best, but they were keeping it for a while, was that the Red Army was no longer the effective fighting force that it was in the Second World War. I mean, they kind of lost a good amount of resources, money, and morale when they invaded Afghanistan in 1980 and, pulled out about a decade later. But, the army, the Russian army, the Soviet army, whatever, was under-equipped, untrained, completely and utterly incapable of meeting modern military standards. And, this was witnessed really in two situations. The first was internally in Russia, in this area called Chechnya. Now, Chechnya is within Russia, right? Not within any of the other former Soviet republics. But there was this independence movement within Chechnya. And for a brief moment, Chechen rebels, terrorists, mercenaries, irregulars, just a ragtag group of people with, Kalashnikovs, effectively seized control of the region. And kind of governed it as this, breakaway parastate, demanding their own independence. Now, in the grand scheme of things, holding on to Chechnya doesn't really do anything as far as Russia was concerned, right? I mean, from an economic standpoint, Russia could have gotten rid of Chechnya and they wouldn't have been worse off for the wear. The problem with this situation is that if Russia suddenly was to recognize Chechnya's independence, then that means that every other Tom, Dick, and secessionist Harry wants the same thing. So if Chechnya goes, so does Dagestan, so does Ingushetia, so does Ossetia, so does Tatarstan, so does Siberia, right? And it sort of creates this domino effect of how much more is Russia going to deteriorate to the point where all that we have is Moscow and its surrounding suburbs. So Chechnya kind of lays bare the weakness of Russian counterinsurgency. And while no international state is calling for Chechnya's independence, from 94 until the end of the decade, the area is basically ruled by a number of rebels and terrorists, right? It becomes just this no man's land that eventually will be retaken, but for the time being, it's a black hole in Russia's own territory. The final nail in the coffin took place in Serbia, not Siberia, but Serbia. Okay? And Serbia is a lot like Russia in the sense that it is an emerging country from a collapsing larger country called Yugoslavia. You might remember Yugoslavia from the non-aligned movement. Serbia was the largest republic out of them. And within Serbia, right, after every other republic breaks away, Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, Bosnia, Montenegro, whatever, there's an area within Serbia, kind of like Chechnya, populated by a group of people that are different from Serbs, and they call for the independence of the province of Kosovo. And like Chechnya, right, Serbia engages in counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency strikes, but the Albanians of Kosovo are much more savvy on the international front, and they have spent years carefully and meticulously refining their good relations with the United States, right? Like literally just fawning over everything coming out of the United States, even to the point of brown-nosing the Clintons, the Bushes, whatever it happens to be. So the United States takes it upon itself to aid the Albanian separatists. Russia is adamantly opposed to this, especially if it is coming outside of a UN resolution. But the United States enjoys the 1990s far better than Russia does, where Russia was just one disaster after another. The 1990s for the United States was quite possibly one of the best decades that they experienced, I don't know, since the 50s or whatever, right? It's just one victory after another. We begin the 90s with Operation Desert Storm in Iraq. We end 1990s with Operation Enduring Freedom, or whatever it is that we want to call it, by helping and aiding a group of people that are brutalized by ethnic cleansing and terrorism and all sorts of stuff. And, America likes to play the cowboy. So Russia is basically ignored on the international front. Right? The United States basically says to Russia, that's nice, but we don't care what you think, and we're going to do it anyway. So Russia ends out the 90s by being, for the most part, irrelevant, even at the UN. So there's just one disaster after another characterizing Russia in the 1990s, which is why I like to call this period Russia's Weimar period. And, a lot of academics have kind of done that, Russia's Weimar period, a period of, immense political volatility, economic instability, and the rise of, radical political alternatives on both the right as well as the left. So, who knows what was going to happen? By this point, Yeltsin was more half in the bag than anything else. The man was not doing well health-wise. He was always known to have a drinking problem, but, more and more he showed up late for meetings. His nose was, red like a reindeer. The man was his liver was already pickled. So Russia just kind of becomes this embarrassment, right? We go from a decade from the Soviet Union until the end of 1999, until January 1st, 2000, Everybody was basically preparing for Y2K. I remember I was working at the time, and we all were like, what's going to happen when the clocks change? Does everything shut down because the world thinks that it's 1900 again? And ever since, Vladimir Putin has been changing Russia, whether you like it or not, for the better, right? Vladimir Putin, the judo expert. Vladimir Putin, the hunter. Vladimir Putin, the bird watcher. Vladimir Putin, the horseback rider. Vladimir Putin, who takes time out for tea, even with little kids. Vladimir Putin, the animal lover. And trust me, this guy absolutely, he's a big, big, big animal rights activist, right? Vladimir Putin, the ultimate badass of the 21st century, It took me a while to do that, so be proud. Look, we know who this guy is, right? I mean, I don't think that there's anybody out there who doesn't know who Vladimir Putin is at this time. But I don't think that there is really an understanding about why he is as popular and as authoritative as he is. And if you're still with me and you understood the nature of Russia in the 1990s, you kind of have a better way of realizing that Putin is seen as Russia's savior, right? Finally, there is a halt to the deterioration. Finally, there is some decisive leader at the top that will not only reverse Russia's fortune, or misfortune for that matter, but go after the very people and organizations that were responsible for said misfortune. So, if anything, right, Russians see Putin today as the type of person that is needed to save Russia from the chaos of the 1990s under Yeltsin. So whereas Yeltsin, who appoints Putin president, Yeltsin retires, literally December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin retires. He issues this thing, I'm retiring as of midnight. And my prime minister, Vladimir Putin, will take over as president. So Yeltsin brings him into the political fray. And what Putin does is, yes, he pardons Yeltsin for all of his crimes and misdemeanors. But Yeltsin is forced into obscure retirement where he dies a few years later, largely unremembered, and few mourn him. But for all of the errors that Yeltsin is remembered for, Putin is marketed, and I say marketed, not remembered, but marketed as the one who's going to fix all of that. But not only that, right? If you know Putin's background, if you know what he was before he became president, right? He was in the KGB, right? He is, he was an up-and-coming KGB member who was stationed in East Germany at the end of the 1980s, right? He had just got out of KGB school or whatever it was, right? He had just kind of graduated, was ready to ascend the ladder of, Soviet authoritative power, right? He's ready, he's newly minted, whatever it is. He's stationed in East Germany at the time. He speaks fluent German anyway. Right at the time the Berlin Wall collapses, So it's kind of like, to use a Star Wars reference, you just finish becoming a cadet. You just finished cadet school in the Empire. You're just about ready to take the mantle of a stormtrooper when the Death Star, blows up or whatever it is, right? So all of a sudden, right, he's out of work. He's recalled back to Leningrad, very shortly afterwards renamed St. Petersburg. And he spends most of his time in the 90s just trying to figure out what to do and where to go. When he is appointed president in 2000, he very quickly chooses to synthesize Russian and Soviet political culture for a new type of Russian identity. And this is very important to note here, folks, because throughout the 1990s, it was very difficult to identify as a Russian while disassociating from being a Soviet. And the only thing that you could really do was promote the Russian Orthodox Church and maybe read some literature and try to make the argument that the czars were not all that bad. Maybe 2 out of 3 would probably work. But there's nothing really politics-wise. Putin comes back and says, hey, you know what? Be proud of the Soviet Union. He's gone on record multiple times to say that the worst thing that ever happened in the 20th century was that the Soviet Union collapsed. Or either that or the Soviet Union collapsing was the worst thing that ever happened to Russia, or something like that, right? He feels that, and he's not a nostalgist, but he's basically saying the country was working fine. Now that it has collapsed, look at the chaos. Look at the uncertainty that it has produced. And this is also something, folks, if you're still paying attention, make a note of. Vladimir Putin, if he fears anything, he fears instability, he fears chaos. That is his big thing. That is his modus operandi, is that his job is to fight against chaos by any means necessary. And so by synthesizing Russian and Soviet political culture and political symbolism together, he immediately plays into the marketing campaign of telling a whole bunch of Russians, hey, I know you're still proud of the Soviet Union. Well, guess what? So am I. Be proud of it. We won the Second World War. We killed more Nazis than anybody else did. We put the first satellite in space. We put the first man in space. We produced all sorts of great things before everything started unraveling. And certainly when you juxtapose the Soviet Union from the 1990s, it's not that hard to see. So he plays into a type of authoritarian nostalgia, or at the absolute least just Soviet nostalgia. Okay? And write this down, right? Whether it's authoritarian nostalgia or Soviet nostalgia or old order nostalgia, this type of nostalgia is necessary only after an extended period of political, economic, and social uncertainty and misery, right? So you don't get nostalgic for something unless the current system sucks. Okay, so like for instance, I have a colleague of mine at Rutgers. He's a grad student still. He's from Iraq. Was in Iraq during the Second Gulf War of 2003. He is no lover of Saddam Hussein. Okay, he is no lover of Saddam Hussein. But I remember asking him a couple of years ago. I said, do Iraqis today, almost 10 years after, 10, how about 20, almost 20 years after the end of the Hussein regime, do some Iraqis miss it, considering what they've been through? And without hesitating, he said to me, absolutely, absolutely. Iraqis today almost will go so far as to say that life was better under Saddam than anything that happens afterwards, right? And of course, you have to factor in the insurgency, the terrorism, the drone strikes, the murders, just the complete collapse of the state. So I'm not saying that Putin comes back to power and says, hey guys, remember how awesome Stalin was? But he is sort of saying the Soviet Union gave you purpose. The Soviet Union, we were something, and we should be proud of that. And look, more than just simply playing the cultural card, he's also using his role as a president to reassert federal authority within Moscow, away from the regional units. So, under Yeltsin, a lot of power was devolved to these various federal republics and centers. And half of these federal states in Russia today are autonomous. Like they make up their own rules. They have their own regional, warlords at this time in the 90s. Russia just became almost a confederation. And when you talk before about how, the time zones between one area and the other, way out in eastern Russia, you can kind of do whatever you want. So Putin is basically saying, no, I'm reasserting control at the center here, right? So, your days of getting away with things are over, right? You don't do anything unless you clear it with me. And so in this case, he's reining in a bunch of corrupt governors, inept politicians, draining the swamp in a certain way. Now, whether he does it successfully or not, it's projected in the media that he is doing it, and the public likes this, especially when a number of these governors, at least in the beginning, choose to, disregard what Putin says. So he's got to put his money where his mouth is, and what does he do? He calls for their arrest. He removes them from power. He strips them of all privilege, throws them in jail, puts them on TV, and the public loves this. Right? The public loves this. Look, how many of you would love to see Mitch McConnell stripped of his powers, stripped of his wealth, stripped of his money, thrown in jail like some ordinary throwaway criminal? Okay? I might be betraying my own personal fantasies right now, but you know what? The person who does that to McConnell or Ted Cruz or, hell, even Donald Trump for that matter, whoever it happens to be, you know what? I will vote for them. Okay? I will definitely vote for them. So Putin is, in some way, shape, or form, promising to make Russia great again. Not just internally, but also reasserting Russia's place in the international arena as both a partner to and a counterbalance to the United States. So not just internally, but Russia is going to reemerge as a power that will work with the United States, but sometimes challenge the U.S. if it feels that U.S. foreign policy interests clash with those of Russia, especially if it's in Russia's neighborhood. Okay? So there's a number of things that go into understanding the new Russia of 2000 and onward. And in order to do this, interestingly enough, the only real political element is the presidency, the executive branch. Right? There is a division of power in Russia, not a fusion, but a division. Right? We have a separate legislative, executive, and judicial. But under Putin, the only one that really matters is the executive branch. And we've been talking about him already. We're going to be talking about him a lot more. Over the next, over the rest of this lecture and the next one, we're going to be talking about three other pillars that kind of keep Russia going. The Russian Orthodox Church, which is largely, although not solely, responsible for defining Russia's identity. A newly recrafted, modernized, re-equipped, and retrained Russian army that represents a renewal of strength and security. And finally, its state-managed economic industries, chiefly wrapped up in the company Gazprom, this semi-national, semi-private company that, for the most part, is the main catalyst of Russia's raw material, natural resource economy. Okay. Let's focus first on the role of the presidency, right? Putin or not, okay? Formally, as I just mentioned, the Russian president is similar to that of the American or French president, right? In that, there is a division of power, a separation of power, rather than a fusion of power. There is a prime minister in Russia. The prime minister is little more than a figurehead, and unofficially, the prime minister is sort of seen as the vice president. Pay no mind to the prime minister of Russia. Okay? The president is the one that has most of the laws, like the United States and France. But realistically speaking, right, we go beyond what is mentioned in the Constitution. The Russian president has extraordinary degrees of power, right? More than all other branches of the Russian government. So, in a working separation of powers between legislative, executive, judicial, it's like, 33, 33, 33%. In Russia, it's kind of like 20, 60, 20, 20, 60, 20, or maybe even 15, 70, 15, right? In other words, the executive branch has an enormous degree of powers that, by and large, makes it really unassailable by either the legislative or the judicial. And the fact that the president has the power to handpick Russia's prime minister, as well as almost half of its regional governors, already means that a good chunk of Russia's political society is at the personal discretion of one individual, right? So whereas in a parliamentary democracy, a prime minister is just the one that, leads the party and becomes prime minister if said party wins the election. In Russia, the prime minister can be anybody, really anybody for that matter, okay? So the presidency, just on paper, already gives the Russian president far more degrees of power than any other formal separation of power state. Under Putin, now you already take, right, a role that has a significant degree of power and you just augment it. Left, right, up, down, backward, forward, whatever, right? Under Putin, the presidency has acquired an almost complete control over mass media, security organs, and mid-level executive bodies. Okay? So we're talking about someone who has either formally or informally influence over things like, things that otherwise would be in the private sector. Okay? So in this case, the media is overwhelmingly going to be pro-Putin because the media outlets are largely financed and supported by his network of supporters and followers. The security organs have their loyalty directly to him. Mid-level executive bodies, I mean, these are, middle management. These are people who will be reminded, if they need to be reminded, that they are where they are because Putin put them there. And he can take them out as well. So don't think that you're rising the ranks on your own merit. You're rising the ranks because you're seen as a useful cooperative partner to Putin. And so, in that sense, folks, there is really no significant political undertaking in Russia that can be remotely possible without the consent and, in many cases, the support of the presidential administration. So in other words, right, things begin and end with Putin signing something, right? So things in Russia do not happen without him knowing about it, without him approving it in that sense. Or not just him, but his inner circle of uber loyalists that make up his cabinet, right? So like a presidential system, even in the United States, right, the president has the right to choose, whoever, they want for their cabinet. You don't have to be part of a political party. And if you look at Donald Trump, I mean, they could be, friends, allies, donors, backers. And it's not just Trump. This stuff goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson. Well, Putin is the same thing. But the people that he chooses to be his inner cabinet, I mean, these are like the inner loyalists. These are people who are given the rare opportunity of exerting autonomous power because Putin believes that they are capable and competent enough to act on their own, but act within the general interest of Russia. So the fact that Putin handpicks his staff, we're talking about Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Diplomacy, Ministry of Finance, all these types of people, right? These individuals are hardcore Putin loyalists who have the ability and the blessing of Putin to exert heavy pressure on both the legislative and the judicial branches as well. And these people are not elected. They're not held accountable by the public. They are just simply seen as aides to Vladimir Putin. Okay? And, when I taught this class about 10 or so years ago, okay, there was a period where, Putin's role as president had to come to a constitutional end. And, it was basically, I think at the time it was a 4-year term where he comes in 2000 and he runs again in 2004 to overwhelming support. I mean, just overwhelmingly he got reelected. But constitutionally, the Russian president cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. So when 2008 comes, the big question was, is Putin going to step down? Or is he going to use the power and popularity that he has to just simply say, you know what? I think I'm going to run a 3rd term. Who's going to stop me? And he makes the decision to step down. And he surprises a lot of people. He does step down after 2 terms under the reasoning that the Constitution says so, and he will not ever, ever violate what the Constitution says. So and one of his last things that he does as president before stepping down in 2008 is he appoints a man by the name of Dmitry Medvedev as Russia's prime minister. And a pattern that we find in Russia over the last 20 or so years is that the president appointing a prime minister is kind of an indirect way of saying, this is my designated successor. I give him my endorsement, and you should lend him the same support that you lent me. So it's not a surprise that in 2008, Dmitry Medvedev runs as president, and Putin backs him, right? Endorses him, whatever it happens to be. Medvedev wins on the popular Putin vote. Medvedev's first act as Russia's new president in 2008 is to appoint Vladimir Putin prime minister. So immediately we were like, okay, this guy he left the parking spot. Oh, he held the parking spot for Medvedev, but Medvedev is going to hold the parking spot for Putin because there's a little loophole in the Constitution. And that loophole says you can't serve for more than 2 consecutive terms, but it doesn't mean that you can't ever come back to office. You just have to take a break, you know? Like, I don't know how many of you, have green cards or know people who have green cards. You can stay in the U.S. for a certain amount of time, but after a certain period, you have to leave the country for like 3 months or 3 days or 3 weeks, whatever it is, right? You got to leave the country, and then you come back in and everything is all fine and good, right? So, when I was teaching this class about, a decade ago, the big question was, will Medvedev in 2012, will he run for re-election? And that's kind of where we left it. And it was a bit difficult to answer because even as prime minister, Putin all of a sudden became Russia's most powerful. Prime ministers at the time were just kind of figureheads. Putin was still pulling strings behind the scene. He still had his loyalists who, he said, you support Medvedev because I'm supporting him. And there was this cult of personality that just kind of grew up around Putin just in those 8 years. We find before he left office that his official portrait, was in schools and offices. He was lauded for leading this type of lifestyle that was a combination of Spartan, simplistic, very ascetic, but at the same time overwhelmingly alpha masculine, right? So, before the Jordan Petersons and before the Ben Shapiros and before the Steve Bannons and, before the alpha male machismo that defines the Trump years of the United States, there was this praise of Putin just kind of being, a man's man, sort of a take charge Gary Cooper type of leader in Russia that, juxtaposed the silliness and the ineptness of George W. Bush, and then just kind of the, fluid whatever of Barack Obama. A lot of people didn't take it seriously. They kind of joked at Putin riding around on horseback with his shirt off or whatever it is, but that stuff was done for the market. That stuff was done to project an image of strength, whereas Yeltsin was just this, old, stumbling, bumbling, man who slurred his sentences. Kind of reminds you of somebody who's running for office right now. So the big thing is what's going to happen in 2012, and as it turns out, Dmitry Medvedev decides, you know what, I've had enough of being president, I'm going to not run for re-election. And half of us in the academic field exchanged money with each other for who won the bet. We realized Medvedev was just holding the parking spot. Putin comes back to run in 2012, and overwhelmingly won. And I need to update these notes because I say and can technically run again in 2016, which is exactly what he did. He ran again in 2016, and I believe at that point, and I forget when this happened, but it's worth pointing out, the term limits of Russian president was extended first to 5 years and then to 6 years. I don't exactly remember when this happened, but I do know that Vladimir Putin will be in office at least until 2022. Now, again, at 2022, his 2 terms are up. What does he do? Does he step down again? And there's a couple of scenarios. He could step down. He could find a replacement. Medvedev is still there, He could step down and say, you know what, I've done all that I can. I'm going to retire. I can't run this country all on my own. And, people will breathe a sigh of relief that the Putin era is over. He could give Medvedev the parking spot for another 6 years. Or at this point, this is the 2020s. This is the era of Donald Trump, Viktor Orban. This is the age of national populism. He could just simply say, I'm going to run for a 3rd term. Who's going to stop him? In fact, he's got the votes in the Russian parliament to, amend the Constitution. He's not going to do it willingly or easily, but he can do it. And there'll be a lot of Russians. There'll be a lot of Russians that will vote for him, if need be. They could vote for him, in perpetuity, in that sense. So, he does, reassume the presidency in 2012. And it is exactly as we said. It affirms a lot of skeptics' fears that Medvedev was more of a placeholder than an evolutionary reformist, right? Medvedev was much more likely to be reformist, much more likely to be moderate. He doesn't carry that type of authoritative baggage that Putin does. But the fact that Medvedev stepped back or didn't fight, didn't challenge Putin's leadership, means that any kind of real reform is going to happen whether Putin wants it or not. Now, he does get reelected, but it does show, at least in the first few years of this period, that the public was not as happy to see him back as some of his supporters might have wanted. And shortly after shortly after becoming president in 2012, a number of events sort of happen. First off, a number of disparate NGO groups that kind of felt like they could finally stand on their own feet under Medvedev began to use their organization, began to use their social media as a way of protesting against Putin's return to power. And if they were seen as large enough and possibly threatening enough, old hybrid regime tactics come and, their internet was suddenly cut. Their headquarters was suddenly locked down. The rent went up. Just a way of demobilizing the opposition. Even within the Russian Orthodox Church, and we're going to talk about the Russian Church in the next lecture, but the Russian Church is probably one of the only institutions in Russia that has the strength, the foundation, and probably the gumph to call out Putin when they need to. And even the church kind of felt that Putin returning to power was a little too authoritarian, right? He could have remained prime minister and he could have done things from behind the scenes, but it's making it look like he is, too power hungry. Of course, the problem here is that whatever grievances the Russian church may have had were immediately snuffed out in the so-called Pussy Riot incident. Okay? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the group Pussy Riot, but it was kind of this Russian punk band made up of various left-wingy progressives, liberals, feminists, things like that, right? And Pussy Riot decided that they were going to stage a protest that would assuredly get the media and the public's attention, because they used to create these flash mob protests in the middle of Moscow or St. Petersburg, and nobody really cared. But they decided one day they were going to run into one of the largest cathedrals, one of the largest Russian churches in Moscow, the Christ the Savior Cathedral, a church that was demolished, detonated by Stalin in the early 30s, and rebuilt in the 1990s exactly to old school specifications. So the fact that the church was destroyed and rebuilt exactly as it was is kind of a testament to the idea that Russian Orthodoxy and Russian Christianity, Russian conservatism, endures against enemies of the state. So for Pussy Riot to enter the church and run all the way up to the front of the church while people were praying, and stage this concert that was denouncing Putin and, calling on, the Virgin Mary to intercede and save women from Putin or whatever it was, right? I mean, just complete and utter shock. And it just appalled everyone, exactly as Pussy Riot wanted. But it kind of went overboard because it backfired. What ends up happening is that people who might have been fence-sitters about Putin immediately had to choose to side between either this group or law and order, right? And those that were, free Pussy Riot and, help out the singers and get them out of jail were branded by the state, right, as terrorists, as anarchists, as the very people that created the chaos in Russia in the 1990s. The church immediately lurched into the reactionary group, right? The Russian church, throughout for the longest time, right, had moderates, they had progressives, they also had reactionary conservatives. After the Pussy Riot incident, the reactionary conservatives just won the show, right? The moderates were just silenced as a result of that. And they, come out and express their, undying support for Vladimir Putin. Of course, what happens shortly after the Pussy Riot incident is the incident in Crimea, right? So there is this, political unrest, instability, revolution that happens in neighboring Ukraine. The pro-Russian government in Ukraine is overthrown in favor of a very weak and highly inept pro-Western government. And in response to that, Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine decide to stage their own counter-protest, in which Crimea, the whole Crimean Peninsula, decides to rise up against Ukraine, declare their independence, and then in their one and only act as an unrecognized state, pass a law that calls for the annexation of Crimea into Russia, which Crimea was part of Russia up to the 1950s, and it's populated by Russians that want nothing else to return to Russia. So the fact that Russia literally annexes Ukraine, like it considers it to be, annexes Crimea, considers it to be part of Russian territory, is a violation of another country's territorial integrity, right? A violation of international law and a complete disregard for the rest of the world. So it's not so much that Putin is reelected in 2012, but that when he comes back, he's seen as much more authoritarian, much more brazen, and much more willing to throw down the gauntlet to the U.S., the European Union, and the neoliberal order and say, come at me, bro. What are you going to do? Right? Are you going to go to war to defend Ukraine's sovereignty? Yeah, I didn't think so. Right? So, yeah, we go from, relatively unknown figure to the most interesting man in the world, a Bond villain. I mean, whatever it is you want to call it. I mean, the guy, if he ever leaves office, he really should, advertise for the Dos Equis beer. He's much more interesting than the guy on the commercial. So this is, I think, a good place for us to stop for the time being, right? I want you to sort of to digest all of this. And we're going to pick up exactly where we leave off here in part 2 by looking at Putin's cult of personality, but how this also now works with the other 3 elements of the Russian state: the church, the army, and Gazprom. So we've got a lot more to cover. But I really hope that you find this stuff interesting. And, again, Russia is not a difficult country to understand. But anyway, stay tuned. We'll be right back with part 2.